Let's begin today's Vanguard news with me redacting my previous statement that Bushiroad has been doing a good job with the anime card reveals, as we get to see Impuldeo's cards in DZBT04, thus ruining any hype we may have watching the anime next week. So those who don't want to get spoiled, now is your chance to leave and still be spoiled by social media anyway. Falstita is your typical D-series starter that proves once again that the Destined ones have the best looking starters that rival their main grade 3 unit. No regret when riding over a grade 0 unit lets you reveal a grade 3 Impuldeo card from your id deck to put a system code exceed token in your order zone. For those wondering why it specifically requires to ride over a grade 0 unit, it's to avoid any players from abusing getting another system code exceed token by riding another copy of itself. This could have been avoided, however, if Bushiroad just simply restricted its skill by riding over Falstita. But I guess they still have a heart and want players to run whatever starter they wish. System code exceed is a token set order, while in the order zone prevents you from riding a grade 3 or higher card that isn't an Impuldeo card, but lets you get self-modification gauges. And while in the order zone, you put a card in your drop zone into your self-modification gauge face up when a card is put into your damage zone during your opponent's turn. Then give your Vanguard 5k power if you have 3 or less self-modification gauges and a trigger unit was not revealed for your damage check. And give your Vanguard another 5k power if you have 4 or more self-modification gauges. Holy shit, this set order basically runs on Vanguard 0 rules when you get damaged. Players have been complaining that there's not enough shields in standard, so Bushiroad's solution is to make players nostalgic for being a Vanguard 0 kid by playing this deck. Dratsivolia, when ridden over by a grade 3 Impuldeo card, makes you put the top card of your deck into your self-modification gauge face up. Then add one card from your self-modification gauge to your hand. Suddenly, the self-modification gauge just became a hero base on easy mode. Destined 1 of Excellence Impuldeo once per turn while on Vanguard lets you pay 1 counter blast to put a card in your drop zone to your self-modification gauge face up. Then call up to 1 grade 3 or lower card from the top 5 cards of your deck, and this unit gets a continuous ability that gives your front row units 5k power for every 2 self-modification gauges. And once per match while on Vanguard, you can pay 1 counter blast and a discard if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or higher and you have 4 or more self-modification gauges to give itself an extra crit and 2 extra drive checks. Talk about being overtuned. Brandgate truly is Bushiroad's favorite child next to Lyrical Monasteria. So for 1 counter blast, you get to fill up your gauge, call something out from your deck, and get at minimum 5k power for your front row units, all the while increasing your defensive capabilities. If Impuldeo even remotely gets a way to toolbox the gauge besides Dratsivolia, B-hero players might as well throw their decks in the garbage. Ironically, the divine skill is the most normal thing this card has in their skill, since the opponent can easily cuck it with a sentinel. Expect now to lose to it anyway, because she won't have a sentinel for plot convenience. Spacewalk Dragon while on rear guard lets you put itself into your soul at the end of the battle it boosted, while you have 2 or more self-modification gauges to retire one of your opponent's grade 1 or lower rear guards. We went from a overturned boss card to a random situational support. If next week's episode makes now leave Rokusei or Impale Horn Dragon on the field without using their skill, only to be retired by this card, she deserves to lose. Gather 2/2 while on rear guard during your turn. Gets 10k power if you have 4 or more self-modification gauges. And 18k vacuum cleaner might be the most Yu-Gi-Oh thing I've seen Vanguard did for a card. Nebula Invoke Dragon while on rear guard lets you pay 1 soul blast when it attacks to get 5k power. It gets 15k power instead if you have 5 or more self-modification gauges. And while on the Guardian Circle, it gets 15k shields if you have 4 or more self-modification gauges. Having Vanguard 0 defensive mechanics wasn't enough, and Bushiroad had to give the deck a 20k shield grade 2 unit that doesn't require intercepting to work. On top of that, it's also a 35k attacker if used with Impuldeo's skill with 5 gauges, and that is without a booster or persona ride. Do you believe me now when I said the deck is overtuned? Flight Transformation Windstar while on rear guard during your turn gets 5k power. If you have 2 or more self-modification gauges, then its drive check cannot be decreased by card effects. If you have 8 or more self-modification gauges, and while on rear guard, you can pay 1 counter blast when it attacks. While you have 4 or more self-modification gauges and you haven't performed drive checks with your rear guards during this turn yet, to let this unit perform a drive check, but it loses 1 drive, and bind this unit at the end of that battle. So on top of Impulsio's quad drive check divine skill, the deck can also twin drive with their rear guard. At this point, I'm just glad the deck can only do 3 attacks and the nation has no generic guard restrict rear guards. Otherwise I would have lost my shit. This is turning into Bad Saga 2.0, as it has all the power and tools, but won't have enough attacks to fully pressure the opponent. Expect Zorga to become even more expensive as it's one of the few decks that can keep recycling their sentinel, which is this deck's weakness. Finally, here's Impulsio's secret rare, which is basically just an SR, but with more stamps. And that concludes this Vanguard news without the bullshit. Special thanks to my Patreon members for continuing to support my content creation. Be sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments how you're tired of seeing someone say how they miss Vanguard 0 again.